I thought the worst part was finding the envelope on the kitchen counter with my name written in my stepmother's handwriting. I was wrong. The worst part came 3 days later, when a woman I had never met knocked on the front door of our house in Oakville and handed me a folder that changed everything I thought I knew about my own life. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it actually started, which was the morning of my 19th birthday, a Tuesday in late October, when the house smelled like coffee I hadn't made and voices I wasn't included in. My name is Nadia Ostrovsky. I grew up in a 3-story house on a quiet street in Oakville, Ontario, about 40 minutes outside Toronto. My mother, Renata, was a landscape architect who spent her weekends drawing plans for other people's gardens and her evenings reading to me on the back porch. She was the kind of woman who remembered the names of every neighbor's dog and kept a jar of peppermints on her desk for anyone who stopped by. She died of a brain aneurysm when I was 15 years old. She was here one morning and gone by afternoon, and nothing in my life has ever felt fully solid since. My father, whose name is Damien, grieved for what I would estimate was about 14 months. I know that sounds like a precise and possibly ungenerous calculation, but I was living in the same house and I was watching. By the time I turned 17, he had met Colette, a woman who worked in commercial real estate and wore perfume that announced itself before she entered a room. By the time I turned 18, Colette had moved into our house with her 2 children, a 16-year-old named Felix and a 14-year-old named Amélie. By the time I turned 19, I had quietly become invisible in my own home. I want to be fair about this. I have tried, many times, to be fair about this. Colette was not cruel in the obvious ways. She never screamed at me or called me names to my face. What she did instead was more efficient. She reorganized the kitchen so that nothing was where my mother had left it. She replaced the living room furniture, piece by piece, over the course of about 6 months, until there was nothing left that smelled or felt or looked like the life we had before. She referred to my father as our dad when she spoke to her children in front of me, and she never once corrected herself or seemed to notice what she was doing. Felix mostly ignored me. Amélie occasionally borrowed my things without asking. Neither of them was my enemy exactly. They were just people who had moved into my house and didn't think much about what that meant for me. My father, for his part, had become someone I no longer fully recognized. He laughed more than he used to, which sounds like it should be a good thing, but the laughing was always in the other room. He was present in the house the way a photograph is present, you could see him, but there was no warmth coming through. On the morning of my 19th birthday, I came downstairs to find my father, Colette, Felix, and Amélie sitting at the kitchen table eating pancakes. There was no extra plate set out. There was no card on the counter. My father looked up when I walked in and said, "Morning," the same way he said it every other morning, and then looked back down at his phone. I stood in the doorway for a moment. I was waiting for something. I don't know exactly what I was waiting for. I had been alive long enough to know that 19 is not a milestone that demands a parade. But it was still my birthday. I was still his daughter. There was still some part of me, small and stubborn and embarrassing, that was waiting for him to remember. He did not remember. Or if he did, he chose not to say anything. I made myself toast. I ate it, standing at the counter with my back to the table because I didn't want to sit down and have to perform normalcy while I was feeling whatever I was feeling. And then I went back upstairs to get ready for my shift at the bookstore, where I had been working since the previous spring. The envelope was on my bed when I got back to my room. It was a standard white envelope, the kind you'd use to mail a bill. My name was written on the front in Colette's neat, slightly backward-leaning handwriting. I picked it up and turned it over. It was sealed. I opened it. Inside was a single folded piece of paper. I unfolded it and read it twice because the first time I thought I had misunderstood. "Nadia, your father and I have been discussing the situation in the house, and we both feel it would be better for everyone if you started making plans to move out. We think you'll be happier with more independence. There's no rush, but we'd like to have a timeline by the end of the month. Please don't make this into a drama. See." I sat down on my bed. I read it a third time. There was no signature from my father. There was no mention of my birthday. There was only Colette's initial at the bottom. That one cold letter that managed to communicate everything I needed to know about exactly how much space I took up in the version of this family that had been built without me. I folded the letter back up and put it in the drawer of my nightstand. Then I went to work. I want to tell you that I was furious. I want to tell you that I marched back downstairs and said everything that needed to be said. But the truth is that I was 19 years old, and I had been slowly, methodically convinced over the past 2 years that my feelings about my own life were an inconvenience to the people around me, and so what I actually felt, sitting on my bed holding that letter, was something closer to a dull, heavy confirmation. Like a word you've been trying to remember suddenly appearing. Of course. Of course, this is what it was always going to come to. I said nothing to my father that day. Or the next day. I went to work, and I came home, and I ate dinner alone in my room, and I did not make it into a drama, because that was the one thing Colette had asked of me, and I was still, even then, trying to be reasonable. 3 days after I found the letter, the woman knocked on the door. I answered it because everyone else was out. She was in her early 60s, with short silver hair and a canvas tote bag over one shoulder and a leather folder held against her chest with both arms. She looked at me the way people look at someone they've been expecting to find. "Nadia Ostrovsky?" she said. "Yes," I said. "My name is Patricia Henshaw. I'm a solicitor. I handled your mother's estate." She paused. "May I come in?" I stepped back from the door. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where my father had eaten birthday pancakes without me 3 days earlier, and Patricia Henshaw set her leather folder down and opened it with the careful deliberateness of someone who understood that what she was about to say was going to require a moment to land. "I want to start by telling you that your mother was very specific in her instructions," she said. "She made me promise that I would come to you in person, not by mail. Not through your father. In person, when you turn 19? I looked at the folder. "What is this?" "Your mother had a significant asset that was not included in the general estate your father received when she passed," Patricia said. "She established a separate holding 4 years before her death. A landscape architecture business she incorporated under her own name. Renata Ostrovsky Design. I knew about the business. My mother had run it from a home office. She'd had 3 or 4 regular clients, a small reputation in the community for garden restoration work. I had assumed, the way you assume things when you are 15 and your whole world has just collapsed, that it had simply dissolved after she died. I had never thought to ask. She kept the business active," Patricia continued, "through a separate trust. She had a colleague, a woman named Susan Marlowe, who maintained the client relationships and kept the books. The business has been operating quietly for the past 4 years. And under the terms of your mother's trust, full ownership transfers to you on your 19th birthday." The kitchen was very quiet. "The business," I said slowly, "has been running for 4 years. Yes. And my father doesn't know." Patricia looked at me steadily. "Your father was told about the trust at the time of your mother's death. He was told it was a minor holding that would transfer to you at 19. He chose not to pursue the details." She paused. "He may not have realized what it had become." "What has it become?" I asked. Patricia opened the folder and turned it so I could see the page she was pointing to. There were numbers on that page. There was a balance sheet. I looked at the total at the bottom, and I had to read it twice, the same way I had read Colette's letter twice. Except this time, I wasn't reading it because I didn't understand. I was reading it because I couldn't quite believe that it was real. My mother's business, which I had thought was gone, had been generating revenue for 4 years. It had 3 active contracts, including one with a municipality in the Halton region. The total asset value, including the contracts, the equipment, and the operating account, was listed at a number I will not repeat here because it still makes my hands feel slightly unsteady to think about. It was more than enough. It was more than enough for everything. "Your mother also left you a letter," Patricia said. She reached into the tote bag and produced a smaller envelope, cream-colored, with my name on the front in handwriting I recognized from grocery lists and birthday cards and the little notes my mother used to slip into my lunch bag when I was in primary school. I did not open it there. I thanked Patricia Henshaw. I took the folder and the envelope. I walked her to the door. And then I stood in the hallway of my father's house, holding my mother's letter in one hand and the future she had built for me in the other. And I allowed myself to feel, for the first time in 4 years, something that was not grief or resignation or the specific exhaustion of being tolerated. I felt like myself. My father came home that evening around 6:30. Colette was already in the kitchen. Felix was upstairs. Amélie was on the couch, watching something on her laptop with headphones on. I sat at the kitchen table and waited, which was something I had gotten quite good at. "Can we talk?" I said, when my father came through to the kitchen. He looked at Colette briefly, the kind of look that communicates something in a language I was not supposed to be able to read. Then he said, "Sure," and sat down across from me. I put Patricia Henshaw's business card on the table between us. He picked it up and looked at it. Something shifted in his face. It was small and fast, and he covered it quickly. But I had been watching my father's face for 19 years, and I knew what it looked like when he was surprised. "She came to see you," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Today," I said. "My 19th birthday was 3 days ago." He set the card back down on the table. "Nadia." "I'm not angry," I said, which was not entirely true but was the version of myself I had decided to bring to this conversation. "I just want to understand a few things. Did you know the business was still active?" A pause. I knew there was a trust. "That's not what I asked." Another pause. Colette had stopped moving around the kitchen. "I knew it was more than a minor holding," he said quietly. "Toward the end, yes. I knew it had grown. I assumed it would go back into the estate." "It was never part of the estate," I said. "Mum made sure of that." He had nothing to say to that. "I'm also going to need to talk to you about the letter Colette left me," I said, "the one asking me to move out by the end of the month." Colette turned around from the counter. "That was a private conversation. It was a letter left on my bed on my birthday," I said. "I'd like to discuss it." "Nadia." My father's voice had gone to the low, careful register he used when he wanted to smooth things over without actually addressing them. "Nobody is trying to push you out. We just thought some independents might." "I've spoken to Patricia Henshaw," I said. "I'm going to be meeting with her next week to complete the transfer of the business into my name. After that, I'll have more than enough resources to make my own decisions about independence." I looked at him steadily. "But I want you to hear me say this. You were my father every day of my life. And 3 days ago, on my birthday, you sat at this table and ate breakfast and didn't say a word to me. And your wife left a letter on my bed asking me to leave. And I have been quiet about all of it because I was trying not to make it into a drama." I paused. "I'm done being quiet." My father looked at the table. He didn't say anything. That was, in its own way, the loudest answer he could have given me. I moved out the following month, not because Colette's letter had won, but because the business, my mother's business, my business, had a small studio office in Burlington that came with a loft apartment above it. Susan Marlowe, who had been running the operations side for 4 years, met me there on a Thursday morning and walked me through every file, every contract, every client relationship she had maintained on my behalf. She was 62 years old and wore paint-stained khakis and spoke about my mother with the matter-of-fact tenderness of someone who had loved her genuinely and had decided the best way to honor that love was protect what she'd left behind. "She knew," Susan said, over coffee at the little table by the window. "She knew she was sick before she told anyone. She had about 6 months where she understood what was coming, and she spent most of it making sure you'd be all right." I thought about my mother sitting in that home office, drawing plans for other people's gardens, quietly building a safety net underneath me while I was in middle school complaining about homework. I thought about her calculating that I'd need to be 19 old enough to manage it, old enough that no one could take it away. I thought about the 14 months my father had grieved, and the next woman he had found, and the furniture she had replaced, and the envelope she had left on my bed. I thought about how my mother had known, in the way mothers sometimes know things, that the house I grew up in might stop being a safe place, and she had made a plan for exactly that contingency without ever saying a word about it that might frighten me. I opened her letter the night I moved into the apartment above the studio. I sat on the floor with my back against the radiator, because I didn't have any furniture yet, and the room smelled like old wood and turpentine, and I read her handwriting in the light of my phone. She told me she was sorry she couldn't be there. She told me she was proud of me in ways she hadn't always found the words to say out loud. She told me that Renata Ostrowski Design was mine to do whatever I wanted with: run it, grow it, sell it, or turn it into something she hadn't imagined. She told me that she had chosen Susan specifically because Susan was both competent and trustworthy, which she said were harder to find together than most people realized. And then, near the end of the letter, she wrote something that I have thought about almost every day since. She wrote, "The people who try to make you small are always the ones who are afraid of how much space you actually deserve. Take up your space, Nadia. Don't apologize for it. I built this for you so that you would never have to." I sat on the floor of my new apartment and cried for a long time. Not the quiet, shut-down kind of crying I had been doing for 4 years. The real kind. The kind that means something is finally moving. The meeting with my father happened about 6 weeks later. He called and asked if we could have coffee. I said yes, because I thought, and still think, that conversations are generally better than silence, even difficult ones. We met at a cafe on Lakeshore in Oakville, not far from the street where I grew up. He looked tired. He ordered black coffee and wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at me like he was trying to find something he had misplaced. "I know I haven't handled things well," he said. "No," I agreed. "I got lost after your mother died. I know that's not an excuse." "It's an explanation," I said. "There's a difference." He nodded at that. "Colette, she's not a bad person." "I didn't say she was a bad person," I said. "I said her letter was unkind. Those aren't the same thing." He looked into his coffee. "She felt like you didn't want to be part of the family." I looked at him for a moment. I chose my next words carefully. Not because I was afraid, but because I wanted them to be accurate. "I wanted to be part of the family," I said. "I wanted that more than I knew how to say. I just wasn't offered a place in it." He didn't have an answer for that either. We finished our coffee. He asked about the business. I told him it was going well, that I had taken on an apprentice, that we had a proposal in with the city of Burlington for a parks restoration project. He listened with the focused attention of someone who is trying to make up for years of not listening, which is both touching and a little late. But I have decided that a little late is better than never. I did not forgive him all at once. I want to be clear about that. Forgiveness, when it's real, is not a single moment. It's a direction you choose to move in, slowly, over time, with occasional stops to rest and reconsider. I am moving in that direction. Some days I cover more ground than others. There is one other thing I want to tell you, because it matters. About 2 months after I moved into the apartment above the studio, I got a message from Amélie. She had found me on Instagram, which felt appropriate, given that Instagram is where teenagers find the things they're not sure they're allowed to look for. She sent a short message that said, "I know things weren't good. I was too young to understand what was happening. I'm sorry if I made it worse." I thought about not answering. I thought about it for about 4 days. And then I wrote back and told her I didn't think she'd made it worse, that she'd been a kid in a complicated situation, and that I hoped she was doing well. We have exchanged perhaps a dozen messages since then. It is not a friendship exactly, but it is a beginning. And I have learned to value beginnings. Felix has not reached out. That's fine. People move at their own pace. And sometimes they don't move at all. And that is information too. Susan retired 8 months after I took over the business. She trained me thoroughly and completely, and said goodbye on her last day by pressing a packet of my mother's original design sketches into my hands and telling me to get them framed. I had them framed. They hang in the studio now, those careful pencil drawings of garden layouts and planting plans. And sometimes when I'm working late and the rest of the building is quiet, I feel like I am sitting in the same room as her. Like she is right there at the next desk, just on the other side of something I can't quite see through. Renata Ostrowski Design is still the name on the door. I kept it. People ask me sometimes why I don't rename it now that I'm running it, and I tell them that the name is exactly right. My mother built the foundation, and I am building the rest of it, and the name belongs to both of us. There is a thing that happens when you have spent a long time being treated as though you don't quite belong in your own life, where you start to believe it. Not all at once. Gradually. The same way a room gets cold, not in a sudden drop, but in a slow, barely noticeable drift, until one day you realize you are shivering, and you cannot quite remember when the warmth stopped. The letter on my bed on my birthday was meant to make me smaller. I understand that now, not with anger, but with something more like clarity. It was written by someone who was afraid of what I represented, not me personally, but the part of my father that still belonged to the life he had before, the life my mother had built, the fact of me, as evidence that she had existed and mattered and left something behind. What Colette didn't know, what none of them knew, was that my mother had already answered that letter. She had answered it 4 years earlier, in a solicitor's office in Burlington, with careful instructions and a signed trust document, and a colleague named Susan, who had kept the lights on while I was still learning how to grieve. My mother was a landscape architect. She spent her career understanding that the health of what grows above the ground depends entirely on what you prepare below it. She planted something for me in the dark, in the years before I knew I would need it. And she tended it, and waited, and trusted that I would find it when the time was right. I found it. If you take one thing from my story, let it be this: the people who love you most do not always make the loudest promises. Sometimes they make quiet plans. Sometimes they work in the background, building things you won't see for years, preparing ground you won't know you needed until the moment you step onto it and feel how solid it is beneath your feet. And if you are the one in your family who has been told to take up less space, to make yourself smaller, to not cause drama, I want you to hear me say, clearly and without hesitation, you were never too much. You were always exactly enough. The people who told you otherwise were simply not big enough to hold you. Take up your space. Someone who loved you already made room for it.